And welcome to the Go Time Podcast here on the Voice of College Football Network. I am your host, Grant Sastry, one of two co-hosts here on the LSU channel of the Voice of College Football Network. It's a very special episode today. We got Wilson Alexander here of The Advocate. He's the lead football writer. He's going to answer a lot of questions that I have for him because huge season for LSU this season, but also the landscape of college football keeps changing, and he's got all the latest on that. But Wilson, welcome to the show. How's your summer been?
Oh, it's been okay. Trying to work on my golf game, and that's always endless endeavor. That one step forward, two steps back, all that kind of thing. But mostly just getting ready for the college football season. And thanks for having me on. Hope you're doing well, Grant. Hope you've had a good summer too.
Yeah, it's been a busy summer, but it's been a pretty fun summer. You can't wait for football season. Right now it's slow, but then you get to July, and that's the media days, and then August hits, and then you're just back to your regularly scheduled program. But Wilson, what the season looming, the 2025 season, we all know the expectations heading into the season. This year for Brian Kelly, they had the number one transfer portal class in the country, had another top 10 high school recruiting class in the country, and on top of that, you have the first game of the year, which is against Clemson, which might be the determined LSU season the rest of the way. So what are the expectations for LSU, and how are they, dealing with this? Because we know about the expectations of LSU, but to me, this is different from any other year that Brian Kelly's been here.
The expectations are, as you said, as always, to compete for a championship. But I think this year specifically, the reasonable expectation for this team is to make the college football playoff. And if you can win a game, or if you can actually really beat a championship caliber team, then that's great. But it's hard to predict after a year in which they've added so much from the transfer portal. We don't know really what this team is going to be, especially I think on the defensive side of the ball, because there are so many new players because of what they did in the transfer portal. But that what they wanted to do in the transfer portal and what they ultimately ended up accomplishing in that was born out of necessity. Because as you said, this is year 4 of the Brian Kelly era, and they have not really sniffed the playoff since he started at LSU. You could argue that maybe they got close in his first year. In his first year, if there was a 12-team playoff, they probably would have made it. And they might have even made a 12-team playoff in Jaden Daniels' 2023 Heisman season. Probably not. I think they would have finished just outside of it, but been right in the mix for that. But then obviously last year they weren't close, finishing 8-4, and so this is a critical year for LSU to prove under his leadership that they can contend for championships. That the reason that he came down here is that they're on track for doing that, and they've got to be able to show that they can after investing quite a bit of money into this roster.
Mm-hmm. And we'll get to a little bit about that later. But what area of the field do you think Brian Kelly Brian Kelly and the coaching staff made the biggest improvement through high school recruiting and the transfer portal? Because there's a lot of position groups. Obviously, you got to talk about the defensive line, but safety made a big jump as well. The cornerbacks. There's a lot of position groups where they seem like they may have some of the best units in the country, just based on how they did in the transfer portal.
Yeah, we'll see. I think it's too early to say something might be the best in the country for any team. But for LSU specifically, it's really just the whole defense, because you just kind of listed it out there. Like, they got better. You would think at the defensive end position, especially if they had not added what they did in the transfer portal, we'd be identifying those edges as a weakness going into this season. But they got some experienced players there. The cornerback room and the safety room, I think the floor is much higher for both of those positions than it was last year. We don't know exactly how good they can be, but there just seems to be more talent in the secondary than there has been really in any other year of the Brian Kelly era. Obviously, they didn't add anything at linebacker, but I really don't think they had to, because you bringing back Whit Weeks, and you have West Weeks now as a fifth-year senior. Maybe he can be kind of a reliable player at middle linebacker. Devon Keys, after a promising freshman year, coming back. And then obviously Harold Perkins off of the ACL. If he can be dynamic, then you've got a lot to like at linebacker. Also, if you're trying to invest in other positions, you probably don't need to really spend your money at linebacker. You needed to spend elsewhere. And so I think that this just defensively, they've gotten a lot better. And talking to people around the program, they think they've gotten better defensively. When you bring back Garrett Nussmeier on the offensive side of the ball, you, to an extent, know what you have in your core offensively. You've got to get better at running the football. You've got to get better at throwing the ball downfield deep. on a consistent basis. But, the defense has not been at the level it needs to be really for a while now at LSU. And maybe they can start to make some strides, even more strides in this second year under Blake Baker, now that they've added the talent. Because last year they changed the coaching staff, but the players are mostly the same. And we saw some improvements because of better coaching, but there was always a limit to how much better they could be. Now that they've replaced so much talent, they may actually be able to have a higher ceiling with Blake Baker and this defensive staff in year 2. And maybe now, after making a solid jump in his first year, maybe now they can actually become like a top 25 unit.
Yeah, definitely. And I have to ask about this because I think you've hit the nail on the head with the defense on the opposite side of the ball. Of course, for the receiver room, you added Baron Brown and Nick Anderson, 2 of the highest rated wide receiver prospects in the transfer portal. Gary Nussmeier, of course, is coming back for his second season after he threw for 4,000 yards, nation's leading passer. And, of course, in the running back room, you bring back Kane Durham, who had a fantastic freshman season. Harlan Barron, JT Lindsey coming in as true freshmen. And, of course, Caleb Jackson returns for his junior year as well. But I have to ask about the offensive line because that is the biggest question for LSU's offense. You replaced 4 of your 5 stars from the year before, which include Will Campbell, who was a top 5 pick. And on top of that, the only other star you have coming back is DJ Chester. But we're still not sure if he's going to be a guard or a center because in the transfer portal you brought in Braylon Moore from Virginia Tech, who was a center there, started over 30 games, but also Josh Thompson started over 30 games for Northwestern. But how do you think the rest of the offensive line plays out? And then also, what should we expect when this offensive line goes up against Clemson on August 30th?
This season is going to hinge on how good the offensive line can be and its ability to replace those 4 starters, because everything that you added doesn't matter if Garrett Nussmeier doesn't have time to throw the football and you don't get push up front to be able to create lanes in the running game. It's not going to matter if they can't, dictate those things up front, and they're going to get tested right away against Clemson. What should we expect? I have no idea because we still don't even know who's really going to be starters, and so many of them are either haven't been starters at LSU or are going to really be first-time starters, like Tyree Adams at left tackle and probably Weston Davis at right tackle. I mean, those are going to be guys who are really starting for the first time. How are they going to be able to handle that, especially against the Clemson defensive front that looks really good? Guys like TJ Parker up there. I mean, they've got some dudes, some NFL-type dudes on the defensive line, and that's going to be tough to have to handle them on the road week 1. It's coming right out of the gates. LSU's got such a tough test against Clemson, and particularly with this offensive line. And so over the course of the season, they might get better, and this team might get better. Even if you potentially lose to Clemson week 1, I don't think it really signals what this team can be unless they get blown out. But even I think about Clemson itself last year, getting blown out against Georgia week 1, and then they end up winning the ACC and, being a playoff team. So it's not, the end of the world. The sky is not necessarily falling, but it will feel that way to LSU fans, if they do lose that season openers because of having not won one over the past 5 years. I digress. The offensive line. I think it's probably going to be, like I said, Tyree Adams at left tackle. I would still probably pencil in Braylon Moore at center. Brian Kelly told me before spring practice that he would be the center and that DJ Chester would be playing guard. We saw them both competing a lot, but that was also in the spring. So, I think we'll see exactly how that shakes out. Maybe DJ Chester holds on to it, but at the moment, I'd still probably think Braylon Moore plays center. Josh Thompson plays right guard. And then Weston Davis plays right tackle. Brian Kelly said after the spring that was probably where Weston Davis will be, really leaving you with that left guard spot for a lot of competition. And DJ Chester would probably have the edge on it because of his experience. So we'll see if that's how it shakes out. That would be my prediction at this moment.
Yeah, definitely. And when we speak about the offensive line, we have to talk about Brad Davis and the job he's done with this offensive line. When he inherited the offensive line, when he came here in O's last year in 21, wasn't a great unit, but over time he has recruited very well. Four of the 5 guys that have moved on are all got drafted to NFL, and also he just keeps making move after move in the recruiting cycle. Because yesterday, Emmanuel Tucker, 4-star offensive tackle from the state of Mississippi, committed to LSU. So how do you rate Brad Davis's job being the offensive line coach at LSU? But then also, how much faith do you have in him to get this offensive line ready, considering the fact that you're replacing 4 of your 5 guys from last year?
Well, knowing Brad Davis, I mean, he's not going to leave any stone unturned. He's going to work. You don't have to doubt that he's going to put in a ton of work and effort into making sure that this offensive line is ready. And we'll just see if it actually is. I mean, that's he's at least going to give it everything that he has. That's how he operates. But, it has to have his job so far. I'd say maybe B plus A minus kind of level, because the offensive line just didn't quite meet what were very high expectations last year, but they just weren't good enough in the run game. And I mean, there was a lot of things that contribute to whether or not you're good in the run game. The perimeter blocking needed to be better. Garrett Nussmeier needed to make some better decisions in terms of his management of it. The running backs probably needed to be better at hitting the hole. But the offensive line, I mean, you heard it from Jack Pyburn, this spring, a guy who played against LSU last year and is now on the team this year coming over from Florida. Like, he said when they watched them on film, they weren't physical enough. And that got exposed throughout the season. They weren't getting enough push up front. And that falls to an extent on Brad Davis, as the offensive line coach, So, those were, there's been some things here and there where the offensive line has got to continue to get better. And he has, in terms of recruiting rankings, recruited very well over the past few years. And this is really the first time that we're going to see just how well he's recruited, this year. I mean, is Tyree Adams and Weston Davis, are they good enough and ready enough to play tackle? You kind of got blessed with Will Campbell being ready as a freshman, and even right away, and then even a couple games into the season, Emory Jones being able to come in and play. That's rare, So his ability to develop these guys is going to be on display this season, and I think we're going to get a better, maybe in some ways, a better sense of just how well he develops these recruits that he's brought in this year compared to maybe some of the past few years. But you also have to give him credit, again, for helping Will Campbell meet his potential in a lot of ways, and for helping Emory Jones become a top 3-round, top 100 pick, and Garrett Dellinger getting drafted, and Miles Frazier getting drafted. Like, Brad Davis has a hand in all that. So I think LSU's offensive line is in a better place compared to when, he first took over. But for it to really get all the flowers and to be, kind of like a strength of the team every single year, now after he has to go and replace all those guys, and all that recruiting has to really pay off moving forward.
Mm-hmm. And this is Wilson Alexander of The Advocate. He's the lead LSU football beat writer for The Advocate. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and also click on the bell for notifications whenever we release a new video or have another live video. But Wilson, moving on to the changing landscape of college athletics. I've read both your articles, the one about Brian Kelly having to recruit the donors to and how LSU built the number one transfer portal class in the country, and then also the one you talked about where I think it was the $20.6 million deal that every college has to give out to athletics. But giving my first question, Brian Kelly has been known as a guy who can't recruit, but during his time at LSU, he's shown that he can. But with the changing landscape of college athletics, it's changed. But not only does he have to change the way he recruits players, but also the way he has to talk to donors. And now donors are going to play a larger part in how you build a team than ever before. So what you learned about Brian Kelly as a recruiter, not for the players, but for the donors through his face-to-face meetings during the fundraising spread that he did to make sure that they had enough money to build this number one transfer portal class?
Well, it was clearly convincing enough. LSU last spring, not just Brian Kelly, Austin Thomas is a big piece of this as LSU's general manager. Scott Woodward was involved. The fact that Bayou Traditions, the collective, began all of its fundraising sort of went under the umbrella of TAF. Like, that was a factor in this too, because of this sort of the name brand that TAF has amongst donors. But LSU, kind of once Austin arrived, they set a fundraising goal of $10 million for the collective. And LSU not only hit that, it exceeded that. And that was because of Brian Kelly and Austin Thomas and Scott Woodward, like, going to donors and people in the collective going to donors and pitching this vision of what they wanted to do in the transfer portal and what they needed for the roster, because this was a year in which you could still use the collective dollars. And before revenue sharing takes effect, LSU was able to front load at least $10 million to football players between basically January and the end of June. And before that stuff is scrutinized by the clearinghouse that is coming to fruition, and taking effect as a result of the House settlement. And so all the donors who I spoke to said that, obviously it was convincing because they gave the money. They ponied up what they needed. It was, they didn't want to keep seeing 8-4 types of seasons, and for LSU's roster to get to a better place, that's what recruiting is oftentimes nowadays. It's you got to be able to spend, and LSU had not been spending enough. LSU last year spent $5.5 million from the collective, LSU's collective, I should say, spent $5.5 million on the football team. And we heard other numbers getting thrown around, like Ole Miss spent more than 10. Ohio State's AD said they spent 20. Then LSU's talking about 5.5. I mean, that pales in comparison. And you could see it. I don't think there was quite the depth that LSU needed, the high-level talent. There wasn't enough of it. And so Brian Kelly has said on a few occasions, and you can just believe him or not, that was sort of a calculated decision, that they were waiting to really invest in this year's team. Well, if that's the case, and now you're pushing all your chips sort of in a way into this 2025 roster with a returning quarterback. And so we'll see if all these sort of financial decisions work out. I'm sure the donors are going to be expecting things now that they've ponied up even more money than they have in the past.
And when I was reading your article, one of the beliefs that I had was, you've seen a lot more investment in the collective in NIL because of the Bryce Underwood decommitment from LSU to Michigan. And your article confirmed it. So can you elaborate on how Bryce Underwood's flip served as a galvanizing moment for LSU's donor base? Was it anger, fear, or was it just finally clarity about the reality of NIL and the changing landscape of recruiting and college athletics as a whole?
You phrased that well. The word galvanizing is a good one here because LSU's donors, there were some who were hesitant to really give a lot of money to NIL still. Some of them who I talked to and some of the people from LSU, like Austin Thomas, would say that there was still this belief that maybe teams weren't spending as much as they claimed they were spending. But then once Austin and Brian Kelly and Scott Ward started giving these presentation to the donors really last fall, especially after the Bryce Underwood commitment, they're able to show, no, look, this is how much it is taking to fund a high-level roster these days. Like, you have to spend this kind of money. And there was still, I think, even going into the Bryce Underwood flip, some hesitancy to give. LSU had raised quite a bit of money for NIL. It had not yet reached its $10 million goal. One person at the collective who I spoke to said that he thought that they would, even if Bryce Underwood hadn't flipped, but that the Bryce Underwood flip just lit a spark within the donor base because now Austin Thomas asked him about that, and he said that LSU had been planning to approach the transfer portal the way it did for months. That had really started in particular, I think, kind of in August with their fundraising efforts. That they had, he'd been building this system to keep track of the roster, long before this. But that even he admitted that Bryce Underwood's decision did something amongst the donors to get them to pony up even more money and continue to invest. And that's really the effect that it had. Is internally LSU people there have said like it didn't have a huge effect on what they were doing, what their plans were. Like, it didn't change the plan that they had in place. But externally with the donors, it absolutely got them to pony up more money and helped LSU sign this transfer portal class. As you said, ended up being number one in the country according to 24/7. And so, I think that momentum has continued into the early spring here, having the money to go and sign AJ Halsey and the other defensive tackle from USF. They were able to put the finishing touches on that class. And now it's going to be interesting to see, LSU kind of made this big push, but some of the donors are like, okay, well, we're going to do this big push and then we're not going to have to anymore because of revenue sharing. And so we're going to see if that actually works out here, because that clearinghouse and all these enforcement things are going to have to work for NIL not to continue to be the thing that funds rosters like it has.
Yeah, and you mentioned the the plan that Brian Kelly was giving out to donors, and that was the NFL salary cap model, which they used to determine what positions to pay for and how much they should pay for it. Can you talk about the NFL salary cap model and how it resonated with the donors who may not be as familiar with how NIL functions work and how NIL functions, and then also how did it help LSU secure those 7-figure gifts?
Yes, this was something that Austin Thomas began using when he was still at Ole Miss. working with the company who the name all of a sudden is escaping me. It's in the story. Put together to build this system out, and it gives them a database that's just really easy to manipulate the numbers that LSU is working with. Like you said, what makes it an NFL style model is that there are sort of certain percentages of money that at each position. Like you're going to weight the quarterback more than you are your left guard, kind of like they do in the NFL. And that the amount of money you're spending on the quarterback is sort of similar to what it would be in the NFL in terms of the percentage of your cap. Obviously, the money itself is not the same. You're not paying Patrick Mahomes dollars to Garrett Nussmeier, but you're at least sort of weighting that quarterback position more heavily. And he's able to manipulate that across the roster. And there may be years where they need to or want to invest more in a certain position. But what's cool about the database, he said, is that then it adjusts to that to still keep you under the cap. And I think what resonated from speaking to donors, what resonated with them about this setup is that it's very business-like. Austin has said that it really helps take the emotions out of decision-making. You still might have some of that involved, and there's a player you really like. Maybe you do want to spend a little bit more on them than you would normally for a player at that position. But it helps in negotiations with agents and with those players who say, like, I want such and such money. Well, LSU says, well, look, this is what we value this position, and the player still wants more money. Then they might say, okay, well, you're going to need to go find that elsewhere. You should probably enter the transfer portal because you're not going to get that here. And so then the donors are hearing that's how these things are working nowadays. And these are donors who are running businesses themselves. It makes sense to them, to hear that that's kind of how this is being run, that it is very a lot of numbers and financial decisions are being made and not necessarily emotional ones all the time. And so I think that's kind of part of what resonated with them is that, okay, they have a plan in place. They have a system in place. They're going about this in a way that it makes financial sense. So we're okay putting our money toward this because they're being maybe responsible with it in a way that the donors at least thought so going into the season. And they also viewed it as necessary. But I think that's how the database has really helped, is that it has helped streamline decisions, make them a lot easier to make, especially when things are happening really fast in the transfer portal. And it has given donors confidence in what LSU is doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned Austin Thomas a lot, and I know he was an important part of LSU staff for that 2019 run. He goes to A&M. He builds that Orange Bowl roster. He goes to Ole Miss. He helps Ole Miss with their transfer portal successes throughout the last few years. Just talk about how integral he has been for LSU in this new age of college sports.
He's been a huge piece of what they've done over the past year. LSU under Scott Woodward brought him back from Ole Miss. I mean, this is his third. It's almost fourth time working at LSU. There was a time when he was going to come back and then he got hired somewhere else or something. I can't remember exactly what it was that happened. But he's been at LSU a few times now, understands kind of how it works, and the donors seem to trust him. They seem to like him, and that's key. He and Woodward go a long way back. That's a big part of that as well. And one of the things that Brian Kelly said was that this sort of database system, the software that this company has, like LSU was using it under its previous player personnel staff, but they weren't using it in the same way. And Brian Kelly said that Austin has drilled down a lot deeper on it since he came. And it's just kind of helped. I mean, Austin has been the one really doing all the roster management. He is it's not his title isn't general manager, but that's officially. But that's what you can easily refer to him as, because that's what he's basically doing. That's the spot he's in now. He's overseeing a lot of different aspects of the program, a lot of the roster management stuff, working with the assistant coaches to figure out, what they need, who they are prioritizing and all that. I mean, it's a group effort, but Austin is in front of that in a lot of ways in terms of recruiting of this roster and the building of it over time. Him and Kelly, are both certainly in part of that, but Austin is doing a lot of work on those things.
Yeah, and actually, I was just pulling up your article to find out who that person was. It was Next Gen Prospect co-founder Mark Biddeford. That was the person you referred to earlier.
That's right. Yeah, Next Gen. That's right.
Yeah. So, what exactly is that? And how is that? Because I just read it again. 39 programs model that offense use, which I think is really interesting.
So you cut out for a second, Grant. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so 39 teams are actually using the same thing that Austin Thomas is using. So can you tell people? I mean, you may have already explained it, but can you kind of tell people what that may be, so they may be more familiar with it? Because it's going to seem like if we already have 39 programs using it, there's going to be more down the line.
Yeah, but one of the things about that, though, that Mark told me is that not every program is using it quite like Austin is. Like Austin has worked with them on kind of like growing this thing and building this software to be more like, asking them questions like, hey, could you guys maybe make it do this function, and or maybe bring these things together. Austin has even said that like he still has a vision for what this software could be, that it's not even quite there yet. But Mark spoke really highly of Austin, just talking about his ability as a GM, the way that he sees the big picture and works with people. He's been really helpful for them as they've kind of grown this technology, and it's basically blends a whole lot of like, you can put your, as I understand it anyhow, your recruiting board in there. It can do some scouting things. And then, but it also now has this, salary cap management function, and it can kind of bring all of that together into one place. So you're not sort of like going between a bunch of different spreadsheets to keep track of that stuff. It's kind of putting it all there in one place, so you can sort of see the financial numbers along with the people who you might be recruiting or targeting in the transfer portal. And it kind of helps put all of that in front of you in a way that, at least as Austin has explained it, is easy to visualize and understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And one last question about the transport and NIL stuff before we move on to a few more questions about the NCAA's new ruling and it just seems like everything's changing because of that. It's hard to keep up with it sometimes, Wilson. But how is the perception of NIL changed among LSU traditional boosters over the past year? And do you think that this shift is permanent?
It's changed in that they, as a wide, maybe as a whole, because there's been more money that has been given for it. It has changed in that it is now, I think, understood at how necessary it is in order to compete in an era in which there was no limitations on how much you could spend, and that teams were starting to spend quite a bit of money, like we used the Ohio State example last year. Now, it's not the end all be all. I mean, Ole Miss spent more than LSU, and they kind of ended up in the same place. But at the end of the season. But if you're going to continue to compete, you needed to kind of spend this money. I think that was made very clear to them. I think there was a lot of education that went on. Scott Woodward and Austin Thomas said with those donors about what was necessary. I think that was accepted by more people than it had been before. And the LSU also did a better job of actually trying to grassroots fundraise, which it had struggled with. I mean, they had really struggled with ever getting that off the ground in the past. And they've got a little bit more out of that than they did previously. But also as big money donors, there was more seven-figure gifts for NIL for the football team specifically than there had been before. And so that helped. But I think there's hope, I would say, among the donors that this is not going to be necessary year after year. There is concern among some people who have been involved in this for the past few years that LSU would struggle to keep up financially if teams are allowed to just continue through their collectives to spend willy-nilly and really lean on, billionaire donors, people like in, Texas Oil Money. LSU doesn't have that. There are some, certainly rich donors backing LSU, but as Scott Woodward has said on multiple occasions, and there isn't just one person who they can go to for pretty much anything, and that person will write a check, and it doesn't affect that person very much, and LSU gets the money it needs. Like, they need to tap into multiple people to be able to sort of keep up. And I think there's a hope amongst the donors that does not have to continue, that these rules with the clearinghouse will actually work, that there will actually be enforcement, and that you will not be able to spend third-party NIL like there had been previously through the collectives over the cap. There will still be teams finding ways to get around the cap and over the cap, and LSU is even one of them, and I can explain that further in a minute. But in a real quote-unquote way, not just by writing checks, it's basically pay for play. And I think the donors are hoping that that's going to actually work out so that they don't continue to be asked for money because there is only so much that you want to give year after year. There's donor fatigue is definitely very real.
Yeah, definitely. I know a lot of people are kind of turned off about all the stuff that's happening with college football, with the NIL, and all that in the transfer portal, of course, as well. But there's now a new ruling where LSU has to play. Everyone has to pay $20.6 million to the athletic departments. I know LSU football team is going to get a solid bit of it. Then the basketball teams, and then everybody else. But so, how does LSU plan on? How's LSU planning on paying that $20.5 million cap? And then also, will it be monitored and enforced at the university?
Yeah, I mean, so it's not necessarily going to be enforced at the well, I guess the university will enforce it, but it's sort of like there's also going to be now national enforcement with this College Sports Commission. It's not going to be through the NCAA anymore, but this College Sports Commission, in theory, is going to enforce these rules. There's going to be the clearinghouse, and NIL Go is what it's called, this online platform run by Deloitte, and they are supposedly supposed to monitor every team's spending because all that's supposed to be filed, and be able to see who's staying under, if everybody's staying under the cap or staying within that. And what was the first part of your question again?
How does LSU plan on paying this?
Right. I mean, so they've been working on that over the past year. I don't have a ton of details at this exact moment. I'll have more in a story in the next few weeks, actually. Got some interviews kind of going on about that, how LSU is getting that. I mean, but there's, they've had to adjust their budget, essentially, to find $20.5 million. And now, I mean, LSU is a program with quite a bit of money. You can just sort of spend it in different ways, but they're going to have to adjust how they're spending to be able to come up with what is going to be one of the larger expenditures on an annual basis that the athletic department has. This will be, I think it's in the top 4 or 5 of the things that they spend the most money on every year. But I mean, college sports could find a way to just say, I mean, you could pay the coaches less than you are. The coaches' contracts could stop rising all the time to come up with this money, but we don't really see that happening. So they're trying to find other ways. LSU, one of the things that is going to be interesting that I do know has been going on is they're trying to kind of renegotiate their apparel deal with Nike. They could even bring that to the open market potentially to get more from that. They could, to try to leverage the brand that LSU has to get more money from their apparel deal. There's also going to be sponsorships on the field that's coming. Probably. There's nothing. I don't think LSU is going to do anything on the 50-yard line. They're not going to mess with the Tiger Eye, but on the 25-yard lines, they didn't do it last season. That could be coming now this year. Maybe stuff in the end zones. We saw other teams doing that as a way to kind of monetize space in Tiger Stadium. That's going to show up on TV a lot. Those sorts of things as well could be in the picture as LSU finds the money to be able to pay these athletes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the biggest worries about this, about these new developments, really is the effect that it would have on the rest of the sport, the rest of the non-revenue sports, as well as women athletics. Of course, I know there was a lawsuit that was filed, a Title IX lawsuit that was filed because of the new developments going on, the $20.6 million, $20.6 million cap. So how do you think that do you think it will hurt the non-revenue sports, including women's sports, or how do you think they'll resolve this? Because it just seems like it's all new. It's kind of up in the air. So what do you think is going to happen in the next few months, even years?
Lawsuits, more and more lawsuits. That's probably how it'll get resolved, as everything seems to in college sports these days. It'll be interesting to see if we see federal legislation of any kind, of Congress will actually enact any sorts of laws that maybe solidify some things. Otherwise, probably lawsuits will end up, coming down. And especially with the women's sports, it's going to be interesting to see how that gets challenged, because the NCAA paid out the back damages to former athletes who, $2.8 billion in back damages to former athletes. And 75% of that went to football, 15% to men's basketball, based on the round of revenue that they generated. And LSU and pretty much a lot of other schools that are similar to it have followed that formula as it's decided how to pay out its athletes. And I think that'll probably, see how they're going to go until it gets challenged and maybe forced to change, because those sports do bring in the most money, and the women's basketball and the other non-revenue generating sports, they don't bring in that kind of money. And so until maybe something gets challenged in court over the basis of Title IX, where there's maybe federal law, I have a hard time seeing that change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I got a couple more questions for you. With the first being, will LSU athletics be considered employees under this new model, and how will that affect the university's legal exposure?
So they're not going to be employees. They have revenue sharing contracts, just like they had NIL contracts, but they're not yet considered employees. That's something that the NCAA has continued to preserve, is this sort of idea of amateurism, even though they're really not amateurs anymore. They're getting paid, but they're not employees because they don't want to go down a road, the NCAA and the other powers that be, of collective bargaining and unionization. And, this current administration has sort of sided with that to this point. And so that's sort of where that stands. They're not really employees at the moment, but they will be getting revenue sharing contracts. And there could be situations, because this kind of stuff happened with NIL some, where a university could try to claw back that money if somebody leaves before the end of the contract or breaks that contract. And so it'll be interesting to see if anything like that really comes to light, or a lot of that happened but was done, sort of quietly in the shadows and worked out during the NIL era. But some of that will continue to go on, but very similar to how they had NIL contracts, they weren't employees then either.
Mm-hmm. And my last question, because I think we're both college sports fans, specifically college football. Do you think with this new settlement and everything, do you think that this could be better for college athletics, worse for college athletics, or you think it will be about the same?
I think it'll probably be about the same, in that throughout the year, you won't really, I don't know how much we'll be thinking about what's happening on the field. I would like to see sort of a return to that, where it's like in the offseason, maybe actually talking about football. I don't know, that's how I remember it being when I was growing up. And maybe I just wasn't paying attention to the big monumental shifts in the sport maybe as much. I've thought about this and just sort of pondered it, meditated on it to try to figure that out for myself. And I'm curious to see kind of how this feels moving forward as somebody who is a fan of the sport. Because on Saturdays over the past 2 years, and during the season itself, I think it still feels pretty similar, especially on game days. I still feel like it feels great. Like you cannot beat the atmosphere of a tailgate in a college town on a game day in the fall. Like it's the best. But it's just like this time of year, and then January and like March, where it feels maybe different. And I would like it if it sort of maybe having some parameters and structure in place returned us to some of that sort of feeling, which I'm not defining very well, but hopefully people understand what I mean. But I'm not sure that it will. I don't know. We're just gonna have to kind of see how it plays out, because I just don't think that the athletes getting paid has really changed that very much on a game day. And I think that's what's most important to kind of hold on to, is that it still feels great on a college football game day. There's nothing like it. And I hope that stays the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And Wilson, how can the people find your work, where they can find your social media? Because I think a lot of people here that watch this are LSU fans, and they may not be familiar with me, even though we all are probably familiar with you at this point. But for the people that still aren't familiar with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at WHAlexander_. It has nothing to do with Wales. Oftentimes people think it's Walesander, which fair enough. I'm on Blue Sky if people are over there yet. And then you can also just find our work over at theadvocate.com, NOLA.com. That's the easiest place. And we've got so much going on with the College World Series right now. My colleague Koki and Scott Rabelais are doing a great job covering that out in Omaha. So I'm sure everybody's going to be looking forward to the games this weekend. And maybe LSU's going to go on another run here. We'll see. But yeah, that'd be the easiest place.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you, Wilson, so much for hopping on the Go Time podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Grant Sastray. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and also click on the bell for notifications whenever we release a new video like this one. Thanks again, and go Tigers.